Okay, welcome to video number 3. At the end of video number 2, we asked you to work the model with the subject of staff smoking and through the lens of people working in education, teachers, principals, educational assistants, and so forth. Let's see how you did. Now, your answers won't be identical to mine in most cases, but there should be a few examples where there are. For example, you probably had a belief something like this. I've given you two, and you can see how the two of them together really start to form a foundation to the values, principles, and rules that we begin to apply. So I have two beliefs here. My first is that smoking is bad for kids, and the second is that kids tend to do what they see grown-ups doing. A value. It's important to model healthy living to kids. Okay. A personal moral. Now, this is personal. Don't buy cigarettes for minors. Now, would that get me in trouble if I was buying cigarettes for my underage cousin when it was Saturday afternoon? Probably not. It's a dicey area for sure, and you'll see why in a moment, but it's mostly a personal choice. The principle here is called role modeling. In fact, if you look at the standards for educators, and we'll refer to them again later on, you can see that that's specifically the term that's used there, although it's expanded upon. So this is the short form, and it's a part of standard number 2. Essentially, it says that we're supposed to be role models. There's also laws about this, but the law and again, the ethic are different. So for example, if I went and smoked on a school property, it doesn't necessarily mean that I would immediately get in trouble with the law. Maybe somebody wouldn't come and give me a ticket, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the school district couldn't report me to the teacher regulation branch and have me be in trouble there. And by the way, the opposite is true. Maybe a bylaw officer goes by and gives me a ticket for smoking, but doesn't realize I'm a teacher, and the teacher's regulation branch never knows. So the law here, under the School Act, stipulates that there's no smoking of any kind on school property. Professional ethic. It's a pretty simple one, and this isn't written into the code. But what is written into the Code of Standards is the idea that we have to comply with the law, and the law says don't smoke at school. So that's a professional ethic. And there's a standard. In this case, it's particularly important to understand that in BC, educators expressed themselves as must-dos. And really none of our rules are described as don't-dos. So they're almost all, well, there are all standards. And you'll see that that's actually what they're called. And in standard number 2, it literally says that we must be a good role model. And it also stipulates that that's not only true when we're in our workplaces. It applies all of the time if our conduct reflects poorly on the profession or could put others at risk, such as our employers, the community, or the children and young people we are educating, then it would be considered a violation of the standard. And in this case, the example is the standards for BC educators. So even if you do not have a code of conduct, you can look at this BC educator standards as a good template for what you should likely do in your job. All right, now it's time for us to dig into a more close examination of the specific basic principles associated with community support work and educational assisting. We're going to look at these in small batches, and then after each batch, I'm going to have you do a little bit of work with them so that you get better at interpreting and applying these concepts. We'll learn both the short form and the longer explanation of the concepts. You are more than welcome to talk about them in the short form most of the time, but when I ask you questions to ask you to explain your rationale, you'll need to be able to do that by relating to the long form concepts within these short-formed names. The first one we're going to talk about is called client-centeredness. This principle basically states that the needs, wants, and values of our client come first. They have what we call primacy, so that when we go to work, whatever our client values becomes what we value. But this can sometimes be challenging. What if a client wants something that the employer is not terribly supportive of, or their social worker, or their family member? Well, first let's talk about the one exception here, and that is of children under the age of 19. Under the law, their parents are them. They have the right of acting as the child's best advocate. So for a child under 19, the parent is essentially the client. But what about every other circumstance? Well, one of the most common things I see people do in the field is create unnecessary competition and conflict. They say things like, well, the client's needs come first, and then they alienate the other stakeholders, people who are very important in the life of that client, instead of seeing the opportunity for communication to happen. And sometimes collaboration or negotiation do result in the client changing their perspectives. That's okay, as long as somebody isn't forcing the client to change his perspective, or doing something without getting the client's input, or doing something that is clearly contrary to the client's input. We can still be client-centered. The idea, for example, of having a mother talk to her child and work out their differences so that they have a more unified position on something is quite okay. If we know, however, that that parent is likely to go and do something like bully their child into a particular course of action, chances are we want to get the involvement of other people like our supervisor or the social worker to make sure that that process happens in a way that is going to be ethical and safe. The second principle we want to talk about is equity, fairness, and non-judgment. It's really three things, but they're all very closely associated. Equity simply means that we treat everybody the same, but there's a bit of a difference between the concept of equality and the concept of equity. When you think about equality, you can think essentially about the inputs. For example, if I wanted to treat all people equally, I would give them all $1,000. But not everybody would need that $1,000 to the same extent. For some people, that $1,000 would be almost as little as a penny or a nickel. Whereas for other people, that $1,000 would make a huge difference in their lives. And so we would probably be more interested in an approach that looked at equity, that took a look at that same pool of money and said, if we don't give the money to people who don't need it, and we only give some to people who need a little bit, and we give a lot to people who need a lot, and we end up so that there's more of an equitable distribution or a more balanced outcome, wouldn't that be better? And that's typically the way we do it. We don't give ladders to everybody, we give ladders to people who don't have the ability to reach the shelf. We don't give rain jackets to everybody. We give rain jackets to people who live in rainy areas and don't own rain jackets. Those are the concepts that apply here. But there's also the concept of treating all people the same, no matter what their race, their religion, their gender, their age, and of course, their cognitive or physical ability. So that's an example of equality and equity as well. Fairness is described essentially as due process, the idea that we should treat people with the same kind of rigor as we make decisions or rulings as we would expect others to give us. We should, for example, use evidence rather than just instinct or biases. And we should take people with a non-judgmental attitude. We should accept them as they are. And this is a really important concept when you think about it, because it acknowledges the idea that many of the people we'll support are people who have social challenges, people who others in the community might find scary or unsavory. And if we simply refuse them service based on that, then the people who needed us most would not get our help. So we're supposed to approach people like that without bias. And we're supposed to go back to the central concept above of understanding what they care about, what that individual cares about, and let that be our guide. Our third concept is that of dignity. We spoke about it earlier in this module, and we've spoken about it plenty of times. Dignity is difficult to define for most people, but it can basically be described as having respect and care for the person's emotional, social, and spiritual well-being, treating them with the same seriousness and weight as we give to physical health and safety. Dignity includes some other concepts. For example, it includes the concept of dignity of risk. This concept can best be described this way. There is dignity in taking risk. You could be talking about physically risky activities like water skiing or snowboarding. Or you could be talking about emotionally risky activities like going on a date with somebody or taking a test. But either way, those types of activities are taken by the person because they are not only risky on the side that something could harm the person, but they also risk or could result in some kind of major improvement in the person's quality of life or their overall dignity. And that's why what we're hoping for when we go skiing or when we go on a date. But you can't have one side of that risk without the other. our work as CSWs and EAs is to support people in tackling those same sorts of risks. We don't do it willy-nilly. We have to be really careful to mitigate or reduce risk as much as possible. For example, if you're taking a person skiing, you should probably give them ski lessons, good skis and helmets. If you're going to have somebody go on a date, you might want to teach them some of the rules around dating or some of the concerns and safety issues that they might be aware of. You might teach them some communication skills and social skills so they're as likely as possible to be safe and successful in their date. So we don't just throw people into any risk. If a person said to us, for example, I would like to jump off of a bridge, I would want to find out whether that person was talking about bungee jumping, something where I can see that there's going to be a dignity payoff because it's a thrilling activity, and something that I could mitigate risk for with the right equipment, training, and supervision, or whether they meant they wanted to commit suicide, something which is almost entirely likely to cause harm and will not improve quality of life. In fact, it'll probably take the person's life. And so I would help the person in the first circumstance and not help them, at least not help them in the direct way, with the other one. In that case, I'd act to actually provide their safety physically. Dignity also includes the concept that we do not punish people. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to this as using non-aversive approaches or non-adverse approaches. They're all saying the same thing. We focus on the use of positive practices, practices that improve the person's life. We teach them behaviors, for example, that will help them to get more of what they want, that are more functional for the person. And we focus on things like rewards, encouragement, and so forth. What we don't want to do is focus on consequences. Now, up until this point, consequences are not yet unethical. Some consequences are quite ethical. So, for example, if I go running down the stairs and trip, nature has created a consequence for me. And the staff person that's supporting me might not have been able to do anything to stop it. The staff person isn't unethical because somebody tripped over a rock or ran too fast down the stairs. Another example is a logical consequence. So, for example, if I smash a window at a local school, it's not at all untoward for the school to say to me, you have to do some kind of community service work to pay us back, or you have to pay the money. Where we get into trouble is when we use punishments. And for this, you'll have to go back to your notes. And remember, a punishment is defined as an arbitrary consequence put in place by a person with power over somebody with less power. In other words, an arbitrary consequence is a consequence that is in no way related to the person's behavior. It's just chosen by chance. And the only reason that it works is that one person has some form of power over the other. It could be physical strength, economic power, it could be some kind of policy power, such as the ability to kick somebody out of a program if they don't do their bidding. We don't use those types of approaches. Now, there's a whole bunch of clinical reasons why we don't, but probably the most important thing about them is that they're unethical. And the reason they're unethical is that they cause people to feel undignified. And if you've ever been punished in this way, you know what we're talking about. We also have a principle under this category called the principle of least control and a principle called least intrusion. And they say what they really mean. We don't control people unnecessarily. We don't lock people in their rooms or tie them in their beds. And neither do we intrude on people unnecessarily. We don't go in the bathroom with people who don't need us to go in the bathroom. We don't get in the middle of people's personal conversations with their family members when there's no reason for us to be there. And in fact, not only do we have to have the least amount of control and the least amount of intrusion, but we're expected to constantly see if we can increase the amount of independence a person has. In other words, decrease the amount of control we have, decrease the amount of intrusion. An example of this would be teaching people how to take care of their own hygiene more and more independently so that they could have more and more time without a staff person in that bathroom providing intimate care. The final principle we're going to learn about in this batch is inclusion. Now, we've talked about inclusion before, and it's important to understand what inclusion is all about. Inclusion is a step beyond integration. In the olden days, we used to talk about integration, which can best be described as mixing. In the 1960s in the United States, there was a large controversy as students of African American descent were bused into schools that were largely white. And what they talked about was integration of schools. And that was actually probably the right term, because for many, many years, the white students and the black students just passed each other in the hallway. They really didn't interact in any particular way. There was no feeling of one school or one community when that happened. Instead, everybody was sort of rubbing up against each other, but there wasn't anything good out of it. We used to do that too. We used to think that when we took people with mental health needs or intellectual disabilities or physical disabilities and plunked them down into the community, everything else would sort of happen naturally. But we were wrong. And of course we were wrong, because if the institutions hadn't been compelled by some kind of fear or some kind of feeling, they would never have existed in the first place. So that's what happened. A lot of people just continued to feel fear and apprehension. Our work over the last 20 years has really focused on this concept of inclusion. Instead of just having people being beside each other, really about building connections that matter, meaningful relationships. Some of those are relationships that probably exist in your life already, like friends and family. Many people with intellectual disabilities were taken out of their family homes or were brought by their family to institutions and lost those relationships. So sometimes inclusion looks like rebuilding those relationships. In other cases, it's not about rebuilding, but about discovering. For example, there's a lot of work involved in becoming a friend with somebody. It takes a lot of skill to learn how to do that. And probably you've learned it over the entirety of your life, from the smallest age of your childhood all the way to where you are now. But imagine you'd never really been given the opportunity to gradually develop those skills, or that you simply didn't have very many social opportunities. So inclusion includes things like being given opportunities, being taught and shown and encouraged to take on social skills, and being given the power, being told that you're allowed to do this, that you should do this. And so these things are really, really vital. Sometimes these meaningful relationships have names, like, for example, being a person who has a job, or being a boyfriend, or being a pet owner. Sometimes these things have identities associated with them, and the reason is that they have some value, some significance in our community to the degree that people have named them. So inclusion means that we must actively be doing work to try and create those bridges for people, whether it's helping them to find a job, make a friendship, create intimacies in their life. Those are important to us, and they're important to the people we support. And of course, it also means that we should not tolerate the oldest of our practices, which was segregation. Segregation is a fancy way of saying separating or removing people. And the old models of taking people out of the community where they were born or their community of origin and putting them in a grouping that was away from the larger community and only made up of people just like them is definitely old school and not considered to be ethical any longer. All right, so that summarizes the first four principles. Now I'd like you to test your knowledge. In each of the four things we've just done, see if you can name either a must-do or a don't. Now, in other words, I want you to have a total of 4 statements, and you can choose which one you try to come up with a must-do for and which one you try to come up with a don't for. You might find that in some cases it's easier to define a do, and in others it's easier to define a don't. So to review, the 4 areas I want you to focus on are client-centeredness, equity, fairness, and non-judgment, dignity, and inclusion. See if you can create a rule that stipulates a do or a don't for each one. Pause the video, and when you're done, see what sort of answers you might have given in the next slide. In this particular video, I have not put the answers in another video. All right, let's see how you did. So under client-centeredness, and these are just examples, you might have had other ones that were similar, and I'll encourage you to talk about them in our sessions. You might have said things like, it's a do to invite the person to participate in their annual planning session. We would never want to have that session without inviting them. It's a don't to make medical choices without the client's input and permission. Under the equity, fairness, and non-judgment, this one was one I felt was really easier to do a don't for, but I could still come up with a do. Don't refuse a person safe service based on their race. And a do provide people services of equal quality, I should say there's a typo there, to people of all sexual orientations. Dignity, don't humiliate people. And a do support people to take risks as safely as possible. Inclusion, do help people to build relationships with non-professionals. And inclusion as a don't interfere in family relationships. How did you do? Make sure that you are getting clear on the areas where you're strong and where you have questions so that you can bring those questions to our discussion sessions.